I grabbed the man's ankle and screamed, "Jump! You have to jump now!" My wife and I were celebrating our anniversary at a small beach house on the coast. It was late afternoon and the sun was just starting to dip toward the horizon. I was sitting on the deck with a book when I heard the first pop. It sounded like a distant firework. 10 seconds later, another one followed, and then a thin plume of black smoke began to rise from a small white motorboat about 200 yards offshore. I grabbed my binoculars. I could see a man standing on the bow, waving his arms frantically. There was a woman behind him, trying to push a small kayak off the side, but it looked like the line was snagged. The smoke was getting thicker, and I saw the first orange flicker of flames near the engine at the back. There was no one else on the beach, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. I didn't even think. I kicked off my shoes and ran toward the water. I called out to my wife to call emergency services, but I knew they wouldn't get here in time. The tide was coming in, and the waves were choppy and gray. The water hit my chest like a sheet of ice. I am a decent swimmer, but the current was pulling sideways, and the smell of burning fiberglass was already reaching me. I reached the boat just as the woman managed to tumble into the water with a life jacket. The man was still on deck, trying to beat back the flames with a heavy rug, but the fire was winning. The heat was intense, even from the water. I grabbed the side of the hull and felt the blistering paint. "Jump," I screamed. "You have to jump now." The man looked at me with pure terror. He was older, and he looked paralyzed by the heat and the noise. The engine compartment let out a hiss and a roar as something ignited. I reached up and grabbed his ankle. I pulled as hard as I could, and he crashed into the water next to me. The boat was an oven now. I grabbed the man by the life vest and started kicking back toward the shore. The woman was nearby, clinging to the side of the small kayak, which had half capsized. The smoke was so thick it felt like I was breathing ash. Every time a wave hit us, I swallowed salt water and felt my lungs burning. We were 50 yards from the sand when the boat finally blew. It wasn't like a movie explosion. It was a dull, heavy thud that sent a shockwave through the water. I felt it in my teeth. Debris rained down around us. Small pieces of charred wood and plastic hissed as they hit the waves. My legs finally hit the sand. I dragged the man onto the beach while my wife ran down to help the woman. We all collapsed on the wet shore. I turned back and watched the boat. It was a skeleton of fire drifting further out to sea. The man sat up and coughed. He looked at me and then at his wife. He didn't say thank you. He just reached out and gripped my hand so hard his knuckles turned white. We sat there in the damp sand, listening to the distant sirens finally getting closer. My heart was slamming against my ribs and my skin felt raw from the salt and the heat, but I couldn't stop looking at the horizon. The boat was gone, but they were breathing. That was the only thing that mattered. The sirens eventually got louder, and 2 trucks from the local volunteer fire department bounced down the access road. A white SUV with the sheriff's logo followed close behind. They were too late to save the boat. It was just a black smudge on the water now, about 400 yards out, but they were there for the people. The man, whose name I later learned was Arthur, didn't move from the spot where I dragged him. He just watched the smoke. His wife, Diane, was shivering uncontrollably. My wife, Sarah, had run back to the house and came back with 3 wool blankets and a gallon of water. She wrapped them up while the EMTs started their checkups. I stood back, dripping wet, my feet cut up from something in the surf. I didn't feel the pain yet. I just felt the adrenaline leaving my system in heavy, sickening waves. One of the deputies, a guy named Miller with a thick neck and a tired face, walked over to me. He looked at the smoking remains in the distance and then back at me. "You went out there?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else. "Lucky the fuel tank didn't go while you were touching the hull," he said. He wasn't being mean, just stating a fact. "You're a brave man, or a very stupid one. Probably both." He took my statement. It was short. I told him about the pop, the smoke, and the way the man froze. While we were talking, I watched the EMTs load Arthur and Diane into the back of the ambulance. They were going to the hospital for observation. Smoke inhalation is no joke, especially at their age. Arthur looked at me through the back window as they closed the doors. He still hadn't said a word. The beach cleared out by 8 p.m. The sun was gone, leaving a bruise-colored sky. Sarah and I went back to the house. I took a shower that lasted 30 minutes, scrubbing the smell of burnt plastic out of my hair. We didn't talk much that night. We just sat on the couch, the anniversary dinner we'd planned sitting cold in the fridge. We weren't hungry. 2 days later, there was a knock at the door. It was a younger guy, maybe in his 30s. He was wearing a sharp navy blazer and holding a leather briefcase. He looked like he belonged in a law firm in the city, not on a dusty porch at the coast. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are you the man who helped Arthur and Diane Vance on Tuesday?" he asked. "I am. My name is Marcus. I'm their nephew. They asked me to come by." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. It was thick. They wanted to express their gratitude. My uncle isn't much for words, but he's very aware of what he owes you. I looked at the envelope. I knew what was in it. "I don't want money, Marcus. I just wanted them to get to the beach." Marcus didn't move. He held the envelope out. "It's not just money. There's a letter. And honestly, my uncle told me not to come back until you took it. He's a stubborn man." I took the envelope. I didn't open it until Marcus had driven away in his clean black Audi. Sarah sat next to me at the kitchen table. Inside the envelope was a check for $10,000 and a single sheet of stationery. The letter said, "The boat was named the Second Chance." It was the only thing I had left of my brother. I froze because I thought I had to save it. "You reminded me I had to save myself. Thank you for grabbing my leg." We put the check in a drawer. We didn't feel right cashing it. It felt like putting a price on a moment that was too raw for a bank account. A week passed. The local paper ran a small story about the heroic rescue, but it didn't use my name, which I appreciated. I thought that was the end of it. Then the phone rang. It was Deputy Miller. "Hey," he said, "you might want to come down to the station. We've got some things to clear up about that boat fire." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Just come down," Miller said. When I got to the station, Miller took me into a small room with a laminate table and 2 chairs. He tossed a folder down. There were photos of the charred hull. The Coast Guard had towed the remains in the day before. "The fire didn't start in the engine," Miller said. He pointed to a photo of the bow. "The fiberglass was melted in a specific radial pattern. It started under the floorboards in the forward cabin. Accelerant was used." I felt a pit form in my stomach. "Are you saying it was arson?" "I'm saying someone wanted that boat to go up, and Arthur Vance was the only one on it besides his wife. He was trying to put it out with a rug," I said. "He was terrified. He almost died." Miller leaned back. "People do crazy things for insurance money or for secrets. We did a background check on the Vances. Arthur was a developer in the city, lost a lot of people's money about 5 years ago. He's been living on the coast quietly, but the lawsuits finally caught up to him last month. A judgment came down. He owes millions." I thought about the $10,000 check sitting in my kitchen drawer. I thought about the nephew in the navy blazer. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because," Miller said, "if it was arson and Arthur did it, you didn't just save a man. You saved a guy who was trying to burn his problems away in the middle of the ocean, and I need to know if if you saw anything else. Anything at all. Did he have a bag? Did he throw anything into the water? I closed my eyes and pictured it. The smoke, the orange flicker. Arthur standing on the bow, frozen. I remembered the heavy rug he was using to beat the flames. It hadn't made sense at the time. Who tries to fight a gasoline fire with a rug? But he looked so scared. I didn't see a bag, I said. I saw a man who was about to burn to death. Fair enough, Miller said. But keep your ears open. And if I were you, I wouldn't cash any checks from the Vances just yet. I went home and told Sarah. We looked at the envelope in the drawer. Suddenly, it felt heavy, like it was made of lead. The next day, I drove to the address Marcus had left on his card. It was a small, well-kept cottage about 3 miles up the coast. It wasn't the kind of place a millionaire would live, but it was nice. Arthur was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair. He had a bandage on his arm where the heat had blistered his skin. He saw me walking up the path and he didn't move. He didn't smile. I talked to the sheriff, I said, skipping the pleasantries. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Arthur stopped rocking. He looked older than he had on the beach. Miller is a man who sees shadows in every corner, he said. His voice was raspy. He said the fire started in the bow. He said you owe a lot of people money. Arthur sighed. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, then realized he didn't have a lighter. He just tapped the pack against his palm. I did lose money, Arthur said. I lost everything. That boat was the last asset I had that the lawyers couldn't touch because it was in my brother's name. Why would I burn it? Insurance, I said. Arthur laughed, a dry, hacking sound. The boat wasn't insured. I couldn't afford the premiums. Check the records if you don't believe me. I stayed quiet. The wind was picking up, blowing the smell of salt and pine needles across the porch. The fire started because I'm a fool, Arthur continued. I had a portable heater in the cabin. The wiring on those old boats is a nightmare. It tipped over when we hit a swell. By the time I smelled it, the cabin was a furnace. I tried to use the rug to smother it, but the rug caught too. Everything caught. He looked me straight in the eyes. I didn't want to die out there. I was terrified. When you grabbed my leg, I thought for a second you were the one dragging me down. Then I saw your face. I realized you were the only thing between me and the end. He stood up, leaning heavily on the railing. Keep the money or burn it. I don't care. It's the last of what I have, and I'd rather you have it than the bastards who are suing me for mistakes I made 10 years ago. I didn't know what to believe. I left the cottage without saying goodbye. Life went back to a weird kind of normal. The investigation into the fire stayed open, but nothing happened. Miller didn't have enough to prove arson, and Arthur didn't have insurance to collect, so there was no motive for fraud. It seemed like it was just an accident after all. 2 months later, I was at the hardware store in town. I was buying some deck sealant when I saw Diane, Arthur's wife. She looked frail. She was picking out some light bulbs. I hesitated, then walked over. Diane, it's me, from the beach. She looked up and a small smile touched her lips. Oh, hello. I never got to properly thank you. It was all so fast. It's okay, I said. How is Arthur doing? Her smile faded. He passed away last week. His heart. The doctor said the stress of the accident and everything else. It was just too much. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I thought about the way I'd stood on his porch and accused him of arson. I'm so sorry, I said. He was a good man, Diane said. Her voice was steady. People think they knew him because of the business stuff, but they didn't. He spent the last 3 years of his life trying to pay back the people who lost the most. That's why we moved here. That's why he didn't have any money left. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, tarnished silver compass. He wanted me to give this to you if I ever saw you. It was his brother's. He didn't have it on the boat that day. He'd left it on the bedside table. She pressed it into my hand. It was cold and heavy. He told me that on the boat, when the smoke was so thick he couldn't see the sun, he lost his sense of direction. He didn't know which way was the shore. He said when you grabbed him, you weren't just pulling him into the water, you were pointing him home. I watched her walk out to her car. I stood in the aisle of the hardware store for a long time, just holding that compass. I went home and told Sarah. We took the check out of the drawer. We didn't spend it on ourselves. There was a local fund for the families of the volunteer firefighters, the guys who show up when things go wrong and don't ask for anything in return. We endorsed the check over to them. The following Saturday, I went down to the beach. It was a clear day, the kind where you can see for miles. I walked down to the spot where I dragged Arthur out of the surf. The sand had shifted, as it always does. There was no sign of the fire, no debris left on the shore. I looked out at the water. The ocean doesn't care about our stories. It doesn't care about debts or mistakes or the things we try to burn away. It just keeps moving. I took the silver compass out of my pocket. I checked the needle. It was pointing north, steady and true. I thought about Arthur's hand gripping mine on the wet sand, his knuckles white, his breath ragged. I thought about the pop of the engine and the smell of the smoke. I realized then that it didn't matter if the fire was an accident or a choice. It didn't matter if he was a failed businessman or a hero's brother. In that one moment, under a black plume of smoke, all of that had stripped away. There was just a man who didn't want to die and another man who didn't want to let him. I walked back up to the house. Sarah was on the deck, waving to me. The sun was warm on my back. I put the compass on the mantelpiece next to a photo of our wedding. Every now and then, when the wind blows from the east and the salt spray hits the windows, I look out at the horizon. I can still see the flicker of the orange flames if I close my eyes. I can still feel the heat on my face. But then I look at the compass, and I remember the weight of his ankle in my hand. The news of Arthur's death stayed with me like a cold draft you can't find the source of. It wasn't just the guilt of the arson accusation. It was the realization that I'd been the last person to see him in a moment of raw, unpolished truth. Everyone else saw the lawsuits, the failed developer, or the grieving widower. I saw the man who didn't want to let go of a heavy rug because it was all he had left of a life that made sense. A few weeks after I met Diane at the hardware store, I was out on the deck again. It was a Tuesday, the same day of the week the boat had gone down. The ocean was flat, like a sheet of hammered lead. I noticed a small boat, a skiff, nothing fancy, trolling slowly near the area where the explosion had happened. It sat there for hours. I grabbed the binoculars again. It wasn't the Coast Guard or the sheriff. It was just a guy in a bright yellow rain slicker. He was dropping something into the water, pulling it up, then moving 10 feet and doing it again. He was dredging. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when the same skiff was back, and the day after that. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you've already been told to mind your own business. I walked down to the public pier where the local fishermen docked. I spotted the yellow slicker tied up at the end of the line. The guy was on the dock, hosing down his deck. He was young, mid-20s, with skin that looked like it had been cured in salt. Finding anything out there? I asked, leaning against a piling. The kid didn't look up. Just junk, rebar, old crab pots, a lot of melted plastic. You looking for the Vance boat? He stopped the hose and looked at me then. His eyes were bloodshot. Who's asking? The guy who pulled him out, I said. The kid's demeanor shifted. He shut off the water and wiped his hands on his bibs. My name's Caleb. I worked for Arthur, not on the business side. I was the one who kept that boat running, or tried to. He told told me the wiring was a nightmare, I said. Caleb spat into the water. The wiring was fine. I replaced the whole harness 6 months ago. Arthur was many things, but he wasn't a liar about his gear. He loved that boat more than that house he was living in. The pit in my stomach came back, but it felt different this time. Cold. If the wiring was fine, what caused the fire? Caleb stepped closer. He smelled like diesel and old bait. That's what I'm trying to find out. Arthur called me the night before it happened. He sounded spooked. He said he'd found something in the forward cabin, something that didn't belong there. He wanted me to come look at it Wednesday morning. The boat blew up Tuesday afternoon, I said. Exactly, Caleb whispered. I've been dragging the bottom looking for the fuel manifold or the cabin door, anything that shows how it really started. But the tide here is a beast. Everything gets buried fast. I thought about the second chance drifting as a skeleton of fire. I thought about Arthur's nephew, Marcus, in his clean navy blazer and his expensive car. Did Arthur have any enemies? I asked. Besides the people suing him. Caleb laughed, a short, sharp sound. When you lose people's retirement funds, the list of enemies gets pretty long. But there was one guy, a former partner, named Holloway. He claimed Arthur stole a set of proprietary plans before the firm went under. He's been hounding Arthur for years, trying to get him to sign over the rights to some new development project Arthur was working on in secret. I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I stayed up all night on the computer. I looked up Arthur Vance's old firm. It didn't take long to find Holloway. He was all over the news in the city, big-time developer. Lots of photos of him at charity galas. And right there, in a photo from a fundraiser 3 months ago, was Marcus, the nephew. He wasn't Arthur's nephew. He was Holloway's junior associate. The $10,000 hadn't been a gift of gratitude from a grieving uncle. It had been hush money, or maybe a way to see if I was suspicious. By taking that money, I'd inadvertently signaled that I could be bought. I felt sick. I looked at the silver compass on the mantle. I realized Arthur hadn't given it to Diane to give to me. Diane had given it to me because she knew it was the only thing Arthur had left that was untainted. I drove to the sheriff's station at 7 a.m. Miller wasn't in yet, so I sat in the lobby, drinking burnt coffee and watching the clock. When he finally walked in, he looked annoyed to see me. I told you the case was closed, he said, ushering me into his office. The nephew isn't a nephew, I said, slamming Marcus's card on his desk. He works for Holloway, Arthur's old partner. Miller picked up the card, his face unreadable. And Caleb, Arthur's mechanic, says the wiring was brand new. Arthur found something on that boat the night before it blew. He was murdered, Miller. Or at least, they tried to murder him, and the stress finished the job. Miller sighed and rubbed his eyes. Look, I know you want this to be a movie. You're the hero. You saved the guy. Now you want to solve the mystery. But there's no evidence. The boat is at the bottom of the Atlantic. Arthur is in the ground. And Holloway? He's got 5 lawyers for every one of my deputies. So you're just going to let it go? I'm going to do my job, Miller said firmly, which is to tell you to go home. If you keep poking around and Holloway finds out, he won't send a guy in a blazer with a check next time. I walked out of there vibrating with rage. I didn't go home. I drove to the cottage where Diane lived. The curtains were drawn. The for sale sign was already in the yard. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I walked around to the back and looked through the kitchen window. The house was empty, cleaned out. I went to the hardware store and found the manager. Where'd Diane Vance go? Moved out over the weekend, he said, counting out some change. Said she was going to stay with sister up north. Seemed in a hurry. A young guy in a navy suit was helping her pack. They'd moved her, or they'd scared her into leaving. I went back to the beach. I stood on the deck of our rental and looked at the water. The anniversary trip was supposed to be over 2 days ago, but we'd extended it. Sarah came out and put her hand on my shoulder. We have to go back to the city tomorrow, she said softly. I know. You did what you could. You saved his life that day. Whatever happened after, that's not on you. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I looked at the compass. I remembered the heat of the hull. I remembered the terror in Arthur's eyes, not the terror of a man who'd made a mistake, but the terror of a man who realized the shadows had finally caught up to him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the water one last time. The moon was bright, casting a silver path across the waves. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the compass. I thought about throwing it into the ocean, letting it go, along with the mystery and the guilt. But then I saw a light. Out on the water, exactly where the boat had gone down, a small red light was bobbing. It was a buoy, a new one. I went back to the house, grabbed my binoculars, and focused. It wasn't a standard navigational buoy. It was a marker. Someone had found something. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't call Sarah. I went to the pier. Caleb's boat was gone. I borrowed a small plastic skiff from the rental house, the kind with a tiny 5 HP outboard, and puttered out into the dark. My heart was thumping. The water felt different at night, deeper and more predatory. I reached the red buoy. It was tied to something heavy. I leaned over the side and looked down, but the water was too dark. Caleb, I whispered. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness from about 20 yards away. A boat I hadn't seen, a larger, faster center console, killed its running lights and drifted toward me. It wasn't Caleb. It was Marcus. He wasn't wearing a blazer tonight. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and he was holding a gaff hook in one hand. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Marcus said. His voice was different, no longer the polite professional. It was cold and thin. Where's Caleb? I asked, my hand tightening on the tiller of the small outboard. The kid? He's fine. He's just sleeping off a very long day. He found what we were looking for. Arthur was a smart man. He didn't keep the plans in a safe or a bank. He kept them in a waterproof casing bolted inside the hull of that boat. He thought if everything went to hell, he'd have his leverage. Marcus pointed the flashlight at the buoy. The explosion was supposed to destroy it, but I guess Caleb was right. The hull held together better than we thought. You killed Arthur, I said. Nature killed Arthur, Marcus replied. We just gave him a little nudge. Now, I'm going to need you to move your little toy boat out of the way. We have a recovery to finish. I looked at the buoy, then at Marcus. I was outmatched. My little engine wouldn't outrun his. I didn't have a weapon, but I knew these waters. I'd been coming here since I was a kid, and I knew that the tide was about to turn. In about 10 minutes, the rip, a vicious side current that pulled toward the jagged rocks of the North Point, was going to kick in. You don't want to be here when the tide turns, Marcus, I said, my voice steady. I don't take advice from tourists, he said. He reached down and grabbed the buoy line, starting to pull. I watched him. He was strong, but the object at the end of the line was heavy. He was leaning far over the gunwale of his boat. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just waited. The water suddenly shifted. The rip arrived with a low, guttering growl. The current slammed into the side of Marcus's boat. Because he was holding onto the anchor line of whatever was on the bottom, his boat didn't drift with the water. It tipped. The gunwale dipped below the surface. A wave of cold Atlantic water poured into his deck. Cut the line, I yelled. Marcus was panicked now. He tried to let go, but the line had wrapped around his wrist in the struggle. He was being pulled down as his boat began to swamp. I didn't think. I kicked my little engine into gear and slammed it toward him. I reached over, grabbing the hilt of the bait knife I'd seen on his deck. I didn't grab his leg this time. I grabbed the rope. rope. One clean slice. The tension snapped. Marcus fell back into his boat, gasping, his wrist raw and bleeding. The heavy object, the plans, the secrets, the second chance, sank back into the dark, pulled by the current toward the deep trench a mile out. Marcus looked at me, his face white in the moonlight. His boat was half full of water, the engine sputtering. "It's gone," I said. "All of it." I didn't stay to help him bail. He had a radio and a working bilge pump. He'd make it back, but the leverage was gone. Holloway's prize was at the bottom of a hole no diver could reach. I went back to the shore. I woke up Miller at his house. This time, I didn't ask for a favor. I told him I'd recorded the whole thing on my phone, which was a lie, but he didn't need to know that. The next morning, the sheriff's department and the Coast Guard were at the pier. They found Caleb tied up in the cuddy cabin of a boat at the far end of the dock. He was shaken, but okay. Marcus was gone, skipped town before the sun came up, but his boat was impounded. Inside, they found the accelerant that matched the residue on the boat. It wasn't a perfect win. Holloway had enough money to distance himself from Marcus. Arthur was still dead, Diane was still gone, but as Sarah and I packed the car to head home, I felt a weight lift. I took the silver compass and walked down to the water's edge one last time. I didn't throw it. I tucked it deep into my pocket. The drive back to the city was long, the kind of silence that usually feels heavy, but today felt necessary. The skyline started to rise up over the highway, all glass and steel, a world away from the salt-eaten porches and the gray Atlantic. I kept my hand in my pocket, my thumb tracing the worn edge of the silver compass. 2 weeks later, the news broke on page 4 of the business section. Holloway's firm was under federal investigation. It wasn't because of the boat or Marcus. It was because without the plans, Arthur had hidden the leverage Holloway needed to bail out his latest failing project. The House of Cards finally collapsed. Investors started pulling out, and someone in his accounting department had finally developed a conscience. I was sitting in my office when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. "Hello? I heard you were the one who cut the line," a woman's voice said. It was Diane. She sounded tired, but there was a sharpness to her voice I hadn't heard before. "I did," I said. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm safe. That's all that matters. Marcus was a mistake Arthur made a long time ago, trusting the wrong people. I think he knew, at the end, that the boat had to go. He just couldn't bring himself to do it." She paused, and I could hear the sound of wind in the background, like she was standing near a window. "The check you gave to the firefighters," she said. "They called me. They wanted to name a new rescue boat after Arthur. I told them no. I told them to name it the Second Chance. Arthur would have liked that." "I think so too," I said. "Keep the compass," Diane said. "It was never meant to find a way back to a place. It was meant to find a way forward. You've got a long road ahead of you, and you're one of the good ones. Don't let the city change that." She hung up before I could ask her anything else. I looked out my office window at the sea of cars and the people rushing along the sidewalk. My life was back to normal emails, meetings, grocery lists, and weekend chores. But every once in a while, when the humidity gets high and the air smells like it might rain, I can still feel the cold water hitting my chest. I can still feel the grit of the sand under my fingernails. I never saw Marcus again. Word is he's somewhere in South America, or maybe just buried under a new name in a different city. Holloway is facing 10 years for fraud. I went to the basement that evening and found an old wooden box. I put the compass inside, right next to my father's watch and a few shells I'd picked up on the beach when I was a kid. I didn't need to carry it in my pocket anymore. I knew where north was. Sarah came down the stairs, leaning against the doorframe. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, closing the box. "I'm good." We went upstairs and ate dinner. We talked about the future, about maybe buying a place of our own one day, maybe somewhere inland, where the only water was a quiet lake that didn't hide any secrets. I realized then that the rescue hadn't ended on the beach, and it hadn't ended at the buoy. It ended here, in the quiet of a Tuesday night, with a clear head and a steady heart. Arthur was gone, the boat was a memory, and the ocean was still rolling 300 miles away. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next pop of an engine or the next plume of smoke. I was just living, and that was the best way to honor the man I'd pulled from the fire. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. The city has a way of swallowing stories, grinding them down until they're just another blurred memory in the rush of traffic and noise. I went back to my job as an architect, sitting at a desk and drawing lines that were meant to stay straight and predictable. But my eyes would always wander to the clock around 4 p.m., the exact time the first pop had echoed across the water. I thought I was done with advances. I thought the box in the basement was the final chapter. Then, a package arrived at my office. It was a heavy, flat crate, about 3 feet wide. No return address, just a local courier stamp. I pried it open with a screwdriver in the break room, and the smell of cedar and salt hit me instantly. Inside was a piece of the Second Chance. It was a section of the transom, the wood charred and blackened on one side, but the other side had been sanded down and polished until the grain glowed like honey. There was no note, but I knew Caleb's handiwork when I saw it. He must have gone back down after the investigation cleared. He'd found a piece of the soul of that boat and brought it back from the dark. I didn't put it in the basement. I took it home and hung it in the hallway, right across from the front door. A year to the day after the fire, Sarah and I drove back to the coast. We didn't stay at the same house, we couldn't, but we found a small inn further south. The weather was identical. A low sun, a slight chill, and a sea that looked like it was holding its breath. We walked down to the public beach near the pier. A small crowd had gathered. In the center was a brand new rescue vessel, painted a bright, defiant red. It was sleek and fast, built to handle the kind of currents that had nearly taken me under. On the bow, in clean white lettering, it said, "The Second Chance." I saw Caleb in the crowd. He looked older, his face more lined, but he looked steady. He nodded at me from a distance, a silent acknowledgement between two people who knew exactly what lay beneath the surface of the water. He didn't come over to talk, and I didn't go to him. We didn't need to trade words. We'd already traded enough. As the ceremony ended and the boat was lowered into the water, I felt a hand on my arm. I turned, expecting Sarah, but it was a woman I didn't recognize at first. She was younger, maybe in her early 20s, with Arthur's high cheekbones and his deep, guarded eyes. "You're him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm the guy who was there," I said. "I'm Arthur's daughter, Elena. Diane told me where to find you." She looked out at the new boat. "My father spent his whole life building things that didn't last. Skyscrapers, companies, reputations. He was so ashamed when it all broke." She reached into her bag and handed me a small, leather-bound notebook. This was his journal from the last year. He wrote about that day. He wrote about the man who screamed at him to jump. He said he'd spent years waiting for someone to tell him he was allowed to leave the wreckage. I took the notebook, the leather cool against my palm. "He wasn't a perfect man," Elena said softly, "but he wanted you to know that the $10,000 wasn't a bribe. Marcus told him he delivered it as a gift from the heart. My father died thinking he'd done one last right thing. Please, don't hate him for the rest of it." I looked at the red boat hitting the waves, its engine humming with a powerful, healthy rhythm. I don't hate him, I said. I just wanted him to live. He did, she said. For a few months, he actually lived, without the weight. That's more than most people get. She walked away toward the pier, and I stood there with Sarah as the sun finally dropped below the horizon. The sky turned that same bruised purple I remembered from the night of the fire. We stayed until the stars came out. I realized then that I'd been looking for a reason for all of it. A reason why I was there, why the boat blew, why the plans were hidden. But the ocean doesn't provide reasons. It only provides moments. You're standing on a deck, you hear a sound, you run, you grab an ankle, you scream. That's all there is. The rest, the lawsuits, the secrets, the silver compasses, is just the wake we leave behind as we move through the water. I reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her grip was warm and solid, the only thing that felt real in the cool night air. We walked back to the car, leaving the second chance to patrol the dark. I kept the notebook on my nightstand for a long time before I dared to finish the last dozen pages. Reading a dead man's private thoughts feels like trespassing, especially when those thoughts are centered around the moment you almost watched him die. Arthur's handwriting got worse toward the end, shaky, jagged lines that looked like the pulse on a hospital monitor. The final entry wasn't about the money or the lawsuits. It was about the silence of the beach right after I dragged him up. He wrote, "The sand was in my mouth and my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. I looked at the man who pulled me out. He looked as terrified as I was. In that moment, I realized I'd been holding my breath for 10 years, waiting for the world to finish me off. When the boat blew, the debt was paid. I was just a man on a beach. Nothing else mattered." That entry changed how I saw the hallway in my own house. The charred piece of the transom wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that everything the houses we build, the names we make for ourselves, can be stripped away in 10 seconds of fire. 2 years after the rescue, I got a call from Deputy Miller. He was retiring, moving out to a ranch in Montana. He sounded different over the phone, less like a cop and more like a guy who had finally seen enough of the worst in people. "Thought you should know," he said. We picked up Marcus, not in South America. He was working a real estate scam in Florida. He's looking at 15 years. He started talking the second they put the cuffs on him. Confirmed what you said about the buoy. Holloway's going down for conspiracy too. "Does Diane know?" I asked. "She knows. She's the one who gave the feds the paper trail Marcus thought he'd burned. She'd been sitting on it the whole time, waiting for the right moment to strike so they couldn't wiggle out of it. She's a lot tougher than she looks, that one." I hung up the phone and went out to the small garden Sarah and I had started in the backyard of our new house. We'd moved away from the city center, closer to the woods. I liked the trees. They were grounded. They didn't shift like the tide. I realized then that I was finally done. The mystery was solved, the bad guys were behind bars, and the second chance was patrolling the coast, keeping other people safe. But the story didn't feel like a movie ending. It felt like a long, slow exhale. I'm 45 now. My joints ache when it rains. A gift from that sprint into the cold Atlantic and the years of construction sites. Sarah and I have a daughter now. We named her Maya. She has no idea about the boat or the man or the silver compass in the wooden box. One day, I'll tell her. I'll tell her that life is mostly quiet, mostly predictable, but that there are moments when the world will demand something of you. I'll tell her that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about grabbing a man's ankle when the paint is blistering off the hull and the air is turning to ash. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I go down to the kitchen and look at that piece of the boat in the hallway. I touch the charred wood, feeling the rough texture under my fingers. It reminds me that I'm lucky. I'm lucky I was sitting on that deck. I'm lucky I had my binoculars. I'm lucky I knew how to swim. But mostly, I'm lucky that when I yelled, "Jump," Arthur Vance listened. I look out the window at the dark trees and the quiet street. The world is full of people carrying secrets. People sitting on boats that are slowly catching fire. People waiting for a hand to reach through the smoke. I can't save them all. Nobody can. But I saved one. And in the end, when the tide comes in and washes everything else away, that's the only thing that stays above the water. I head back upstairs, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I check on Maya, then climb back into bed next to Sarah. I close my eyes and I don't see the fire anymore. I just see the horizon, clear and wide and waiting. I fall asleep to the sound of the wind in the leaves, and for the first time in a long time, I don't dream of the ocean. I'm finally home.